Hello, my friends. The Christmas period offered an unusually stark snapshot of the moral and strategic bankruptcy at the heart of the Ukraine project and its Western sponsors. Volodymyr Zelensky's public Christmas message was not a call for peace, reconciliation, or even restraint. Instead, it was an invocation of death. When Zelensky declared, "May he perish," in a religiously framed address, the target was obvious. This was not subtle rhetoric. It was a thinly veiled wish for the death of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. For a leader presented by Western media as a defender of democratic values, such language was revealing. It underscored the degree to which Ukraine's political leadership has embraced a civilizational framing of the war that leaves no room for compromise, diplomacy, or coexistence. This message was followed immediately by the publication of Ukraine's so-called 20-point peace plan, a document jointly shaped with the United States and European partners and unveiled in Berlin. Despite being marketed as a peace initiative, it was nothing of the sort. It was a maximalist ultimatum, one that demanded Russia's strategic capitulation while offering nothing in return. The Kremlin's response was measured and predictable. Dmitry Peskov made clear that Russia would not discuss such proposals in public and that any serious negotiations would have to take place behind closed doors. This was portrayed by Western outlets as obstructionism, but in reality, it reflected Moscow's consistent position since mid-2024. Contrary to Bloomberg's claim that Zelensky's 20-point plan represents a starting point for negotiations, Russia's terms were articulated clearly and publicly long before this document appeared. In June 2024, Vladimir Putin laid out what are now commonly referred to as the root causes framework, sometimes called Istanbul Plus. These terms address NATO expansion, Ukrainian neutrality, territorial realities, and long-term security guarantees. They were not improvisations, they were the culmination of decades of Russian warnings ignored by Washington and Brussels. To pretend that Zelensky's plan resets the negotiating baseline is to erase history deliberately. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been one of the few European leaders willing to state openly what others only whisper privately. The European Union, he noted, is now a war economy because it has little else left. Nord Stream is gone. German industry has been hollowed out. Energy costs have exploded. Growth is stagnant. What remains is militarization, arms production, and perpetual confrontation with Russia. For years, Western officials insisted that Russia was the one trapped in a war economy. The reality is the opposite. Russia has adapted, diversified, and stabilized, while Europe has sacrificed its industrial base for geopolitical fantasies. Orbán also pointed to something even more destabilizing: institutional disintegration. Decisions made in Brussels increasingly fail to translate into compliance at the national level. The EU has fractured into two camps, the war camp and the peace camp. Hungary stands openly in the latter, while Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and the Baltic states dominate the former. The fact that the pro-war faction currently holds power does not mean it represents the long-term will of European societies. It simply reflects the degree to which democratic accountability has been hollowed out under the banner of values. This erosion of democratic norms is nowhere more visible than in the escalating censorship regime across the EU, justified almost entirely through the prism of Russia and Ukraine. The United States' recent decision to impose limited travel restrictions on several European officials involved in censorship triggered outrage in Brussels and Paris. Emmanuel Macron framed the move as an attack on European sovereignty and digital autonomy. Yet this indignation rings hollow. European regulators, particularly figures like Thierry Breton, have openly threatened U.S. companies and interfered in American political discourse, including issuing public warnings to Elon Musk on the eve of a U.S. presidential interview. These actions were not about protecting citizens. They were about controlling narratives, especially narratives related to Ukraine, NATO, and Russia. The Digital Services Act, chat surveillance initiatives, and sanctions against journalists such as Diana Panchenko demonstrate that the EU's claim to be a guardian of free expression is performative at best. Ursula von der Leyen's declarations about freedom of speech stand in stark contrast to the EU's own sanctions regime, which targets dissenting voices with asset freezes, travel bans, and financial exclusion. Kaja Kallas's reaction to the U.S. travel restrictions was particularly revealing. She condemned the measure as unacceptable while simultaneously having advocated for blanket visa bans on Russians, proudly declaring that travel to Europe is a privilege, not a right. This hypocrisy is not accidental. It reflects a broader moral double standard that underpins Western policy toward Russia. Sanctions, censorship, and collective punishment are justified when directed at Russians, but framed as tyranny when applied inward. Germany's termination of political party bank accounts and Lithuania's expansion of warrantless surveillance powers further illustrate how the Ukraine war has become a pretext for dismantling civil liberties. Under the justification of countering Russian influence, states are granting intelligence services extraordinary authority to monitor, search, and suppress opposition. The word Russia has become a universal solvent, capable of dissolving constitutional protections, due process, and political pluralism. Perhaps the most illuminating insight into how this war became inevitable comes from declassified archival material documenting conversations between Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush. These records confirm what Moscow has said consistently for decades. Putin warned Bush explicitly that NATO expansion into Ukraine would create a long-term field of conflict. He explained that Ukraine was already deeply divided, east, center, and west, and that forcing NATO membership would fracture the country further. He emphasized that such a move would not benefit the United States, would antagonize Russia, destabilize Europe, and ultimately trap Washington in a prolonged confrontation. Bush's response, as the documents show, was confusion rather than engagement. Putin laid out historical context, security logic, and geopolitical consequences in painstaking detail. Bush appeared unable or unwilling to grasp the implications. The same pattern repeated with Georgia. Putin warned that dangling NATO membership without real security guarantees would embolden reckless behavior. Georgia would be tempted to provoke conflicts it could not win, believing Western protection would materialize. That is exactly what happened in South Ossetia. The archives also reveal that Putin warned the United States about Osama bin Laden and the Taliban prior to 9/11, warnings that were brushed aside. This pattern of dismissing Russian intelligence, experience, and strategic reasoning is not incidental. It reflects an entrenched belief in Washington that Russia's perspective is inherently illegitimate. Fast forward to today, and the results are visible. Ukraine has been devastated, Europe is destabilized, the United States is deeply entangled in yet another open-ended conflict, and Russia, far from collapsing, has consolidated its position militarily, economically, and diplomatically. Even the ruble's strength is now framed as a risk by Western analysts, a rhetorical contortion that exposes the emptiness of prior predictions about Russia's imminent collapse. This war was not inevitable. It was chosen through arrogance, ideological rigidity, and the systematic dismissal of Russian security concerns. The tragedy is not merely the destruction of Ukraine, but the refusal of Western leaders to acknowledge their role in creating the conditions for this catastrophe. Until that reckoning occurs, peace will remain elusive, not because Russia rejects it, but because the West has yet to abandon the illusion that it can dictate terms in a world that no longer bends to its will. What the Ukraine conflict ultimately exposes is not merely a regional war, but a systemic failure of Western strategic culture. The crisis did not emerge from misunderstanding or miscalculation. It emerged from a deliberate refusal to accept limits. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States and its European satellites operated under the assumption that Russia's objections were performative rather than substantive. Moscow's warnings were treated as noise, as rhetorical bargaining, never as hard red lines rooted in historical memory and security logic. Ukraine became the arena where that arrogance finally collided with reality. The insistence on framing Russia's actions as unprovoked is not simply inaccurate. It is intellectually dishonest. It requires the erasure of NATO's eastward expansion, the abandonment of arms control treaties, the militarization of Ukraine after 2014, and the transformation of that country into a forward operating platform for Western intelligence and military infrastructure. This was not accidental drift. It was policy, and policies have consequences. Zelensky's rhetoric, particularly his Christmas message invoking death rather than peace, is emblematic of how Ukraine's leadership has internalized Western absolutism. There is no longer even a pretense of reconciliation. The language is theological, moralistic, and totalizing. Russia is not portrayed as an adversary with negotiable interests, but as an existential evil to be destroyed. This framing makes compromise politically impossible and diplomatically meaningless. It also mirrors precisely the language used in Washington and Brussels, where the war has been elevated from a geopolitical contest into a moral crusade. The so-called 20-point peace plan fits squarely within this logic. It is not designed to end the war, but to freeze Russia into a position of permanent strategic inferiority. It demands territorial surrender, political submission, and security vulnerability, while offering no credible guarantees in return. From Moscow's perspective, accepting such a framework would not be peace. It would be delayed defeat. Russia's refusal to engage publicly with such proposals is therefore not obstinacy, but rational state behavior. What is striking is how Western media continues to misrepresent Russia's negotiating position as opaque or shifting. In reality, Moscow's terms have been remarkably consistent. Neutrality for Ukraine, no NATO expansion. Recognition of territorial realities created by the war. Security arrangements that acknowledge Russia as a legitimate great power rather than a defeated adversary. These demands were articulated clearly in June 2024, reiterated multiple times since, and grounded in decades of precedent. The idea that negotiations must begin from Zelensky's plan rather than Russia's stated conditions is not diplomacy. It is fantasy. Europe's role in sustaining this fantasy has been particularly destructive. Viktor Orban's description of the EU as a war economy is not rhetorical exaggeration. It is an empirical observation. Europe has dismantled its energy security, sacrificed industrial competitiveness, and subordinated economic policy to military objectives that serve primarily American strategic interests. Germany's deindustrialization is not collateral damage. It is the predictable outcome of severing affordable Russian energy in favor of expensive, unreliable alternatives. At the same time, the EU's internal cohesion is eroding. The division between war and peace camps is not merely ideological, it is structural. Countries that benefit least from confrontation with Russia, Hungary, Slovakia, parts of southern Europe are increasingly marginalized, while decision-making is centralized in Brussels institutions that lack direct democratic accountability. This creates a feedback loop in which policy failure is met not with reassessment, but with increased coercion. Censorship is the primary tool of that coercion. Under the banner of combating Russian disinformation, the EU has constructed a digital surveillance and enforcement apparatus unprecedented in scope. Journalists are sanctioned. Bank accounts are frozen. Travel is restricted. Entire narratives are criminalized. The irony is profound. Institutions that claim to defend democracy now operate through administrative punishment rather than public debate. Ursula von der Leyen's insistence that the EU Commission is the guardian of values would be comical if the consequences were not so severe. The United States' limited travel sanctions against European censorship architects briefly exposed these contradictions. The outrage from Paris, Brussels, and Tallinn revealed how accustomed European elites have become to asymmetry. They are comfortable sanctioning Russians, silencing dissent, and regulating foreign platforms, but react with indignation when even symbolic measures are applied to themselves. Kaja Kallas's past celebration of visa bans on Russians underscores this hypocrisy. What is framed as moral necessity when directed outward becomes tyranny when turned inward. The expansion of intelligence powers in countries like Lithuania further demonstrates how the Russian narrative functions as a universal justification. Warrantless surveillance, political targeting, and preemptive repression are all normalized through the invocation of external threat. Once again, Russia becomes the all-purpose excuse for suspending liberal norms. This is not strength. It is fear masquerading as resolve. The declassified Bush-Putin conversations offer critical context for understanding how we arrived here. These documents dismantle the myth that Russia failed to communicate its concerns. Putin was explicit, patient, and historically grounded. He explained why NATO expansion into Ukraine would create permanent instability. He warned that Ukraine's internal divisions would be exacerbated, not healed. He pointed out that the United States would gain nothing strategically while assuming enormous long-term risk. These were not threats, they were forecasts. The tragedy is that those forecasts were accurate. Ukraine has fractured. Europe is destabilized. The United States is now entangled in a conflict it cannot decisively win and cannot easily exit. Bush's inability or refusal to engage with Putin's reasoning reflects a deeper pathology in American foreign policy, the belief that power eliminates the need for understanding. The same pathology appeared in Georgia, where false promises of NATO protection encouraged reckless behavior. It appeared in the dismissal of Russian warnings about bin Laden prior to 9/11. Again and again, Russian intelligence and strategic assessments were ignored, not because they were flawed, but because acknowledging them would have required restraint. Today, that refusal to acknowledge limits continues. Even economic indicators are twisted to sustain the illusion of Russian failure. A strong ruble is framed as dangerous. A weak ruble would also be framed as dangerous. The conclusion is predetermined. Russia must always be failing, regardless of evidence. This is not analysis. It is narrative maintenance. In reality, Russia has demonstrated resilience precisely because it prepared for confrontation long before it arrived. It reduced dependency on Western financial systems, diversified trade, invested in domestic production, and maintained strategic depth. The West, by contrast, assumed that sanctions would substitute for strategy. When they failed, the response was not reconsideration, but escalation. What makes this conflict particularly dangerous is not the balance of forces, but the imbalance of perception. Russia views the war as existential, tied directly to national survival and sovereignty. The West treats it as a tool useful for weakening Russia, disciplining Europe, and justifying internal controls. These asymmetrical stakes make compromise difficult but not impossible. What prevents peace is not Russian intransigence, but Western refusal to accept a multipolar reality. Until Washington and Brussels acknowledge that Russia is not a defeated power, that Ukraine cannot be transformed into an anti-Russia fortress without catastrophic consequences, and that security must be mutual to be durable, the war will continue. Not because Russia desires endless conflict, but because it refuses to submit to a system designed to erase it. History will not be kind to those who ignored the warnings, dismissed diplomacy, and mistook moral posturing for strategy. The record is already clear. The only question that remains is how much more destruction will be required before reality is finally allowed back into the room. The Ukraine war will not ultimately be remembered as a story of borders or battalions. It will be remembered as the moment when the Western political class finally exhausted the credibility of its own myths. The myth of moral superiority, the myth of rules-based order applied selectively, the myth that power, once accumulated, need never be constrained by reality. Ukraine became the proving ground for those illusions, and the cost of that experiment is now impossible to conceal. Russia did not stumble into this conflict blindly. It did not act impulsively or without warning. For more than 2 decades, Moscow articulated the same core message with increasing urgency. Security is indivisible. NATO expansion is destabilizing. And Ukraine is not a neutral chessboard, but a fault line saturated with history, identity, and blood. These warnings were delivered privately and publicly, diplomatically and strategically, patiently and repeatedly. They were dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because acknowledging them would have required the West to abandon its posture of unilateral entitlement. When diplomacy failed, Russia concluded correctly that words alone were no longer sufficient. At that point, the choice was not between war and peace, but between war now and strategic suffocation later. States that wish to survive do not outsource their existential security to the goodwill of adversaries. Russia understood this. Ukraine's leadership, encouraged by Western promises it could not enforce, did not. What followed was not merely a military conflict, but a civilizational collision between two models of order. One model insists that sovereignty is conditional, that alliances expand without consequence, and that narratives replace negotiations. The other insists that borders, buffers, and balance still matter, that security must be reciprocal, and that great powers do not accept encirclement disguised as partnership. The outcome of this collision is still unfolding, but its direction is increasingly clear. Despite unprecedented sanctions, economic warfare, and political isolation, Russia did not collapse. Its state institutions held, its economy adapted, its military recalibrated. Its society absorbed pressure that Western planners assumed would fracture it. Meanwhile, Europe absorbed costs it had not prepared for: energy insecurity, industrial decline, social unrest, and the quiet realization that it had sacrificed autonomy for alignment. The United States, distant from the battlefield, used Ukraine as leverage, but even Washington now faces strategic fatigue and domestic fragmentation. Ukraine, tragically, paid the highest price. Its sovereignty was not strengthened but hollowed out. Its economy survives on external life support. Its political discourse has narrowed to a single acceptable narrative enforced by law and fear. Its future is mortgaged to institutions that view it less as a nation than as a forward position. This is not liberation. It is dependency rebranded as heroism. The most dangerous illusion still circulating in Western capitals is the belief that time is on their side. It is not. Time favors the actor with strategic patience, internal coherence, and existential clarity. Russia possesses all three. The West possesses none in sufficient measure. Escalation does not change that equation. Censorship does not change it. Sanctions do not change it. They merely postpone recognition. Peace will come not when Russia is exhausted, but when the West finally accepts that it cannot dictate the security architecture of Eurasia alone. It will come when Ukraine is allowed to exist as a bridge rather than a battering ram. It will come when diplomacy is restored as a serious instrument rather than a public relations performance. Until then, the war will grind on, not because Russia seeks endless conflict, but because it refuses to surrender its future to a system that has proven itself incapable of restraint. History is already rendering its verdict quietly and without slogans. It will record who warned and who ignored, who escalated and who explained, who governed through strategy and who governed through narrative. When the noise fades and the documents surface, the through line will be unmistakable. This war was not caused by Russian ambition, but by Western denial. And denial, unlike power, does not survive contact with reality.